Evidence-Based Strategies series, Guiding the Targeted Improvement Plan Process. My name is Tessa Frost, and I serve as the Nebraska MTSS Regional Support Lead for Region 5.
And my name is Scott Ekman, and I serve as a Nebraska MTSS Regional Lead for Region 1.
The Nebraska Multi-Tiered System of Support Team, in collaboration with the Nebraska Department of Education's Office of Special Education, has created a series of webinars to guide the implementation of the evidence-based strategies identified in the Targeted Improvement Plan. Since we know that students who are identified as needing special education support deserve to be in the general education classrooms first and foremost, these webinars should be used to support district and school-wide continuous improvement efforts. As part of the series, there are 4 crash course webinars that will focus on each of the evidence-based strategies, 1 staff rollout webinar, 4 classroom implementation webinars, and a database decision-making webinar. The purpose of this webinar series is to enhance the classroom implementation of evidence-based strategies with a focus on Tier 1 core support and fidelity within an MTSS framework, and it is applicable to all classrooms within a district. This can be beneficial for school leadership teams to assist in the facilitation of implementation, as well as educators directly implementing the strategy and administrators supporting those efforts. So welcome to the classroom implementation on positive constructive feedback. Throughout this webinar, we will provide a brief review of how the Targeted Improvement Plan, or the TIP, is part of a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS framework. Along with this, as quick reminders, we will review major components of positive constructive feedback. We will then begin to explore fidelity, as well as the importance of fidelity within Tier 1 core practices. This begins with an understanding of fidelity within a MTSS framework and identifying ways to measure Tier 1 core fidelity of positive constructive feedback from a comprehensive view and by specific elements. We will end our time by connecting classroom implementation of practices and strategies to implementation science, which will assist with consistency and sustainability. So first, let's identify how the TIP fits into an MTSS framework. The goal of the Targeted Improvement Plan is to improve learning and educational outcomes for students with disabilities. Data shows that the majority of students with disabilities in the state of Nebraska spend the bulk of their day in the general education classroom. Because of that, the selected evidence-based strategy is intended to be used at the Tier 1 core level in the general education classroom. Research tells us that the best way to improve outcomes for students with disabilities is by improving education for all students. In order to ensure each student has access to evidence-based practices as required by the TIP, we need to build structures and systems that allow for inclusive practices to ensure each student has access to those core practices. There is clear and consistent evidence that inclusive educational settings can confer substantial short and long-term benefits for students with and without disabilities. What we know is this can occur through a well-developed MTSS framework. Remember, MTSS is how we organize the supports we provide for our students. We identify the supports through a layered continuum that recognizes what we do for all students, for some students, and for few students. We know that by establishing our Tier 1 core supports through effective instruction and high-quality instructional materials, the majority of our students will be successful. Once we are implementing our Tier 1 core practices effectively, we can then accurately identify those in need of further assistance. Due to the interconnectedness, there is a focus on social, emotional, behavioral, and academic needs that promote positive relationships between staff and students. And as we consider our Tier 1 efforts, we must continue to evaluate and strengthen our key foundational components that we know support all students in a safe, welcoming, and predictable environment. Through preventative and proactive approaches, we can provide social, emotional, behavioral, and academic support for all students while building positive relationships. Through processes such as the Targeted Improvement Plan, we can focus on the fidelity of implementing evidence-based practices such as positive constructive feedback by establishing a supportive atmosphere. We covered the 4 major elements of positive constructive feedback from high leverage practices in depth in our crash course that can be found on our website at nemtss.unl.edu. As a quick review, it is important to remember that positive constructive feedback is goal-directed, constructive, immediate, and respectful and positive. More specifically, positive and constructive feedback is just that, respectful and positive, but includes being genuine and age appropriate, making sure that the feedback is delivered immediately after student responses. The feedback fits within the instruction, the phase of learning, and the expectations of students to really provide meaning and connections to their learning. The feedback is clear and brief, and it's given after specific actions, and it's specific and goal-directed, so students really understand why they are receiving the feedback.
Okay, so now that we've had a brief review of that targeted improvement plan and specifically positive constructive feedback, we're going to shift our focus and begin to focus on the role of fidelity and how fidelity plays a part within our MTSS framework with a specific focus on Tier 1. So when we think of the why, and we think about why we focus on fidelity, many of our minds go to Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. Simon explains the need to focus on the why, which is not just simply knowing why things are done or with a focus on the result. When we really focus on the why, we're acknowledging the purpose or belief behind it. So as we think about that in terms of fidelity, we're going to focus on 3 whys, and that have direct impact on student outcomes. So to really get to the why of fidelity, what we're going to do is we're going to look through the lens of ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, and IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Act, or Disabilities Education Act, along with MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support, while keeping a distinct focus on positive student outcomes. So within the Every Student Succeeds Act, districts need to provide equitable equitable opportunities for all students, of which all should be done with fidelity to ensure we are considering and meeting the requirements of ESSA. Per ESSA, districts shall address the learning needs of all students, including children with disabilities, English learners, and gifted and talented students. This can be accomplished through the development of programs and activities that increase the ability of teachers to effectively teach all students, which may include the use of multi-tiered systems of support and positive behavioral interventions and support. A comprehensive continuum of evidence-based systemic practices to support a rapid response to students' needs with regular observation to facilitate data-based individual instructional decision-making, and to provide services, programs, strategies, and interventions to all students in need and ensure that students with disabilities, with developmental delays, who are English learners, and who are struggling can meet the challenging state academic standards. Not only do we need to ensure ESSA is considered, but we must meet the needs of all learners and focus on special education as well. Which leads us to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Implementing instruction with fidelity satisfies one of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act's legal requirements for appropriate instruction and plays a critical role in determining whether a student received adequate instruction. All students are provided with the opportunity to access general education instruction and materials, which should be aligned with state standards. In doing so, this will allow diagnostic or multidisciplinary teams to make valid determinations. It is also important to note that ESSA and IDEA both mention multi-tiered systems of support, such as MTSS. As schools implement and continuously improve their multi-tiered system of support, fidelity is going to be essential for both teacher and student success. When the skills to facilitate change in fidelity outcomes are developed, it is possible to create long-term systems change leading to higher strategy effectiveness and efficiency. Through this process, staff will have the ability to identify gaps in instruction with more timely data-based decision-making. In doing so, there is an enhancement of core instructional materials. As we know, which is central to the why, this all leads to increased quality and consistency in student outcomes.
All right, now that we have grounded ourselves in the why, we will identify the components of Tier 1 core fidelity. Before we explore system fidelity, we need to establish common language and define the word fidelity itself. According to the Nebraska MTSS Framework document of 2023, fidelity is defined as the degree to which a program, curriculum, intervention, or strategy is implemented as designed through research. Within this context, we will focus on strategies being implemented as designed. But first, we need to understand the connectedness of MTSS and fidelity to enhance Tier 1 core practices. Fidelity is key to school infrastructure by ensuring effectiveness of a MTSS framework. Through the use of fidelity assessments, key components of instructional strategies, which provides clarity and consistency. When teachers are aware of these instructional key components and how to implement them, they are more confident in their instruction, which leads to higher efficacy. Teachers also need to utilize the fidelity data, which enables them to draw connections between the strategy they have implemented and improved outcomes for students. This data-based decision-making plays an integral role in enhancing a MTSS framework. Beyond this, when we focus on fidelity data, teams need to make sure there are very clear responsibilities written so everyone knows what their roles are. By doing so, this allows for quality shared leadership to best support teachers and students. When considering implementation of your selected evidence-based strategy from your targeted improvement plan, There are two things to think about when it comes to measuring fidelity. As you may recall from the staff rollout webinar as part of the series, there was a concentration on fidelity to the process. To address any MTSS Framework systems approach to implementation. This webinar will explore measuring fidelity to the implementation of a strategy within individual classrooms. As part of this classroom implementation webinar, we will identify ways to measure Tier 1 core fidelity of classroom implementation of your selected evidence-based strategy from a comprehensive view and by individual elements within your selected strategy. Before making a decision around providing additional support, teams need to ensure that the decision is a reflection of a student's need for additional support as opposed to a need for effective Tier 1 core support. This might occur at the school, collaborative, or student support teaming structures, which are dependent on the district. To distinguish these needs, the team must have confidence that the delivered instruction matches the instructional approach that originally generated demonstrations of effectiveness. This spirit means that evidence-based practices in a given tier need to be implemented with fidelity before additional and targeted interventions are added. In terms of continuous improvement, this could also mean that a goal might focus on the fidelity of an identified target change. When we look closer at fidelity, we can think about it as measuring fidelity to instruction and measuring fidelity of instruction. Fidelity to instruction assists in determining if we are following core components of the strategy as well as frequency of implementation. If measuring the process, we would want to examine if the teacher was following the core components or essential ingredients of instruction and how often they were using it. Fidelity of instruction looks at the quality of delivery and adapting to student needs. If measuring the fidelity of instruction, we focus on the needs of the students being met, and if the teacher was able to effectively differentiate, scaffold, and/or adapt instruction. We also look at how complete the lesson was, how engaged the students were, as well as if the teacher utilized clear and concise language to ensure students understood what was being taught and asked of them. We know this is a lot of information, so we also have some guiding questions. So these are just some questions to consider when thinking about fidelity in the classroom. The ones on the left in green target fidelity to instruction, while the ones on the right in teal target fidelity of instruction. These questions can be helpful for teachers to self-reflect, but also for teams to use when considering fidelity checks. There are many ways in which fidelity can be measured, but two specific methods that may be helpful for assessing fidelity in schools are the use of fidelity checklists and the evaluation of permanent products. However, for our purpose, we are going to focus on checklists. Fidelity checklists are checklists comprised of tasks specific to a curriculum, instruction, or an intervention that are written out and checked off as they are completed. These can be collected by a self-report or direct observation by a third-party observer. When developing a plan for assessing fidelity through a checklist, it is necessary to identify the core components of the practice or intervention that will be the focus of assessment. And that can be done by completing a task analysis of the instructional method. Then the checklist is created based on those core components, making certain that those critical activities for student learning are included. And with that in mind, we also need to consider validity and reliability. As you might notice in the visuals on the screen, something is valid when it hits the target, and something is reliable when multiple attempts are in the same area. So when considering fidelity, we really want to see both validity and reliability. Schools creating or selecting fidelity checks need to look at the degree to which it measures what it is intended to, or the validity. As we stated earlier, when considering fidelity within an MTSS framework, it's essential to understand the major components of the instructional strategy. When considering reliability of fidelity measures, staff can compare the agreement between two observers who are evaluating the same activities at a given time. So for example, two staff can observe the same lesson at the same time with the same fidelity measure. And it needs to be clear that this is non-evaluative, but rather an opportunity to enhance instruction. So shortly after the observation, there would be a comparison of the fidelity measure and a discussion about the similarities and differences. If there's high agreement between the observers, that's an indication that it's a reliable measure. So to really empower staff and promote shared leadership and collective efficacy when conversations around fidelity come up, one suggestion from the MTSS Framework document of 2023 is to have teams decide up front, together in partnership with those delivering the work, exactly what fidelity to the evidence-based strategy requires. Monitoring fidelity to these core elements will then be a reflection of the agreement the team has made up together, rather than something that's been imposed upon them. The measurement of fidelity should be the same in each classroom to promote both validity and reliability of the fidelity checklist.
So now that we've learned about some possible ways to collect fidelity, we're going to dig into some specific information about the fidelity of positive constructive feedback, which is possibly the strategy you chose for your tip. So our first example, this is a sample fidelity check that focuses on and being able to use to track positive constructive feedback provided to individual students as well as groups of students. Like all of our examples that we're about to share, you can click on the link on the slide to make a copy of this tool for you to use. But what we like about this is it's a pretty straightforward, easy way to collect both positive and corrective feedback and think about that ratio between the two. Here's another example. Here is a template to collect classroom observation data. And as you can see, this includes the type of activity. It talks about the classroom's expectations and the use of pre-corrects. And then also thinks about engagement strategies and opportunities to respond and the percentage of students that are engaged. In addition, it also collects feedback. So if your district or a school is focused on expectations and engagement strategies used in the classroom, in addition to positive constructive feedback, this could be a template you would consider using. Our next example is the 20-minute high impact survey from Corwin. We like this strategy because, again, it kind of brings in a lot of different elements that you might use when you're collecting some fidelity data across classrooms. So in this particular survey, they look at things such as time on task. Again, our expectations clearly posted or stated. Do we see respect being shown towards teachers and other students? It also gets into engagement strategies as well as thinking about kinds of questions and the level of questioning. And then, of course, our ratio of interactions, again, thinking about that ratio between positive and corrective feedback and how where we are in terms of that ratio. So again, this would be a great survey to use if you're collecting multiple points of data across all classrooms. So once you decided on a certain form or checklist to use, we have to start thinking about, okay, what are we going to do with this data? So it's imperative that when data is collected, it's reviewed and it's used, obviously, to inform decision making. So when collecting data on specific feedback, consider again what would be useful for you and your team. So for example, this particular school looked to answer if feedback was consistently used during different instructional times, for example, math or guided reading, shared reading, etc. And then once they collected that data, they began to think about it from a problem-solving standpoint and began that process of asking, maybe why wasn't it consistent across all instructional times? So the making sure that we find a place to house and organize our data so it's accessible is really important to streamline that process of problem solving, and it allows teams to save time because we have that data readily available. Here's another example of a possible tool for you to use. This is taken from the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Support. And it's called a COOL tool. This COOL tool is actually an effective tool for educators individually to be able to create goal to intentionally provide positive and constructive feedback. This tool would be extremely helpful for a teacher who's working to strengthen fidelity of that positive constructive feedback in their classroom, and allows them to kind of guide themselves into developing a goal for themselves. And then switching gears and looking at it from a building-wide perspective, thinking about it from a maximum impact, it takes collective efficacy with that all hands on deck approach. So this is an example with the picture on the left of a building-wide goal. And this poster was posted in the staff lounge to think about, as a building, where are we? And it provides clarity about the goal that we set, specific to fidelity of providing positive constructive feedback that is contingent, specific, immediate, and genuine, and really just allowed the staff to know, again, as a whole wide building staff, where are we in terms of our goal? So this example is specific to classroom implementation, but could be aligned with our district and school-wide goal setting. So if your leadership team is watching this and maybe you're struggling to find a fidelity measure that meets your needs, one option that you have is to create your own. A couple of reminders when we think about this. One, when creating your own fidelity measurement tool, it's important to ensure that they really are still valid, or they're measuring what is intended to be measured. And then also, like we said before, they're also reliable in that you would get the same results from two different raters. We've provided a few resources on this slide that your team may consider using. One from the National Implementation Research Network on developing and fidelity and assessment. Here is another from the IRIS Center on identifying fidelity measures. And then lastly, from the Office of Population Affairs, thinking about a fidelity monitoring tip sheet. So now we're going to kind of shift gears and thinking about Tier 1 as a whole and Tier 1 fidelity implementation, and really start to connect it with the implementation science. So if you remember from the staff rollout webinar, utilizing the stages of implementation from the National Implementation Research Network is essential when guiding your team through a purposeful approach to managing any system change, specifically in this case, implementing your TIP strategy. One thing to always remember is that this is a long process and we can't expect results overnight, but we need to continue to really emphasize our commitment to these different stages of implementation. So when we think about it from these stages of implementation, when we think about exploration, installation, initial implementation, and so on, this particular classroom implementation webinar is focused on providing support during that initial implementation or elaboration stage. So in this stage, thinking about initial implementation and elaboration, the structures we have established during initial implementation help us expand the initiative to new areas, individuals, or times. One key aspect of elaboration is that we continue to test our implementation and we adjust practices and systems based on the lessons we've learned. So a leadership team could use the problem-solving process to identify areas of improvement, make adjustments, and then evaluate, are we seeing success? So as we move through the elaboration stage, our strategy becomes more established and more embedded just into the daily way of doing business. This doesn't necessarily mean that all parts are fully implemented in all classrooms, grade levels, and buildings, but the strategy itself is recognized and promoted as a worthwhile initiative for all staff. So throughout this stage, you will also want to start to plan how your leadership team is going to organize the fidelity data that we've been talking about that you're collecting so that it's usable during the full implementation stage as we think about continuous improvement. So in this elaboration stage of implementation, school leaders and/or leadership teams are hopefully examining multiple data sources, including classroom fidelity data, student performance data, and all that to determine progress on action plans. As they review that data, it's important that leadership teams adjust and revise these action plans that we've developed and utilize the problem-solving process as needed to meet the needs of students and staff. Another critical feature of leadership support at this stage is to continue to reinforce that overall shared vision of implementation that was established early on. You can do this through actions such as public statements of support that signal these efforts are a priority. Finally, school leaders need to consider the ongoing staff support that's needed to facilitate successful implementation. This means considering what professional learning and structures need to be in place for all staff to be successful and what the school provides to all. Also, as we start to think about what do we provide for all staff, then we can start to identify what are some targeted support that might be needed for some staff. And then lastly, what might be some intensified professional learning or coaching or support that need to be in place for a few of our staff members. So even though this is not a fully inclusive list, these are some good high implementation fidelity indicators to look for and reflect upon. We do want to make a specific point to address the professional learning needed. Too many times we kind of have this assumption that all of our teachers are aware of all things education related, but we know that that's simply just not realistic, and we have to prioritize the professional learning needs of our staff. One way of doing this is if you're utilizing the continuous improvement plan or SIP template that was created in partnership with Nebraska MTSS and the Nebraska Department of Education, there's actually a professional learning plan embedded that your team may find helpful to ensure that all professional learning is tied to district and school continuous improvement goals. So again, as you collect classroom fidelity data, the professional learning plan you set originally will and probably should adjust to then meet more individualized staff needs. Again, thinking about the questions of what are the kind of ongoing professional learning that all staff will need, and what might be some targeted or intensified support that some or a few of our staff need to successfully implement the strategy with fidelity. So to review, throughout this webinar, we've provided a brief review of how the Targeted Improvement Plan, or the TIP, is part of a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS framework. Along with this, as quick reminders, we reviewed major components of positive constructive feedback. We then began to explore fidelity, as well as the importance of fidelity within Tier 1 core practices. This began with an understanding of fidelity within an MTSS framework and identifying ways to measure Tier 1 fidelity of positive constructive feedback from a comprehensive view and by specific elements. We then ended by connecting classroom implementation of practices and strategies to implementation science, which eventually is going to help us with assisting with consistency and sustainability. So as we conclude, we want to thank you for taking the time to learn more about classroom implementation. Just as a reminder, this is just one webinar as part of a series. If you'd like to learn more about the 4 evidence-based strategies identified in the Targeted Improvement Plan, you can view a crash course webinar for each of those. If you'd like to learn more about implementing any of the 4 evidence-based strategies, we have a webinar titled Staff Rollout to assist in those efforts. After classroom implementation is established, which is from this webinar, teams can view the final webinar of the series titled Data-Based Decision-Making to assist in the use of assessment and fidelity data in order to improve outcomes for all students. As always, please visit the Nebraska MTSS website at nemtss.unl.edu to view all of the webinars, as well as find the information needed to contact your regional support lead to address any questions you might have. We thank you so much for spending the time with us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.